Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show. Coming up, we have a conversation with National Review columnist and best-selling author Rich Lowry on his latest book on nationalism and where America, a divided America, goes from here. That's coming right up. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Today we're going to be discussing a very interesting new book called The Case for Nationalism, How It Made Us Powerful, United, and Free by Rich Lowry. Now, many of you who are involved in conservative circles will recognize Rich Lowry, of course. He is the editor of National Review magazine. He was actually selected by William F. Buckley as his successor and editor of that magazine. His columns and editorials are always fascinating and well worth the read, and he agreed to come on the show and discuss his new book and what America looks like going forward in the age of Trump, in the age of populism, and in an age of nearly unprecedented division. Thanks so much for joining us. Here's that conversation. So maybe give us a bit of history and background of nationalism, because it's a really charged term. And over the last couple of years, it's become a very popular term on all sides of the aisle. You have the Trump nationalists, the America First crowd. You have the left saying that the conservative movement is slumping into nationalism. So for the purposes of framing the discussion for the listeners and the viewers, how do you define nationalism, and how do you respond to critiques that nationalism is a dangerous force?
Yeah, so a couple things. One, just to get real technical about definitions. People tend to think patriotism, that's the word for everything good about national loyalty, national feeling. Nationalism is the word for everything bad. That's not true. So get technical about it. Patriotism comes from the Latin word patre, same root as patriarchy, father, fatherland. It's loyalty to your own. Nationalism is the idea or the doctrine that a distinct people united by common culture, common history, very often a common language, should govern a distinct territory. That's nationalism. And I think there have been forms of it throughout human history. Ancient Israel was kind of a kind of nation. Joan of Arc, I discuss her in my book, when she has this vision that I'm going to free France from the English. That's kind of a nationalistic sentiment. But modern nationalism, as we know it, rises up in the 19th century. It's a liberal movement. It's a movement led by people who believe in popular sovereignty, equal rights, and are rising up in opposition to empires or to monarchs, and are animated by the idea that the nation has its own rights and claims and should govern itself. Now, any phenomenon in our fallen world can be distorted and used for malign ends, and nationalism certainly has, because it's such an old and powerful force that a lot of different movements realize that power and want to tap into it. But people make a mistake if they think Nazism, for instance, is identical to nationalism. It's just not. And in World War II, it was the small d democratic nationalists, Churchill, de Gaulle, FDR, who resisted Hitler, who was more than just a nationalist. He had this cracked racial vision of Aryans ruling Germany and ruling all of Europe in this quasi-imperial lunatic racial vision.
So the word nationalism to people, it's kind of interesting. One of the reasons you have to define your terms is because when you say the word, different people hear different things. And it's even caused this sort of cleavage on the right, because it wasn't all that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, that a lot of the people over at, say, like the Weekly Standard were promoting nationalism as a way to bring the country together. But now that Trump is using the word, and now suddenly it becomes a much scarier word, to what extent has Trump's rise actually triggered a second look at nationalism and caused people like yourself and a number of other right-wing intellectuals to really start to take a close look at nationalism and the potential that it has for America going forward?
I think it has triggered such a rethinking among some folks, myself included. And I think just you go to the average conservative audience now and you say you're a nationalist, and no one really blinks an eyelid anymore. But there are still folks on the right, especially a little more libertarian-oriented, who recoil at the concept and think it's dangerous. So there still is that cleavage on the right over the concept and the idea, and whoever wins out in this internal debate on the right will have a lot to do with how the Trump phenomenon ends, which no one can really say they know. Does he fall on his face next year and he's out and people are turning their backs and forgetting about him, by late 2021 or even sooner, or is he a two-term president?
Right.
So we don't know that. I just think that nationalism needs to be thoughtfully integrated into the conservative program going forward. And I think it's always been part of a thread within conservatism, even if people weren't using the explicit term.
To what extent is this cleavage on the right a division between sort of conservatives and libertarians, with libertarians being inherently suspicious of nationalism, not just because of its history, but because it kind of beckons people to a higher loyalty? Libertarians, of course, are very suspicious of higher loyalties, which is understandable to a degree. But to what extent does that explain the cleavage on the right?
I think it's clearly part of it. And you're right. So I spent a lot of time in my book talking about the American nationalist tradition, and there is one that tends to be neglected. You don't get an American Revolution without nationalism, because the idea is our nation's going to govern itself. It's not going to be ruled by an empire. You don't get the ratification of the Constitution without the nationalists, Hamilton and Washington pushing for it. You don't get victory in the Civil War. So it's a tradition that really begins with Hamilton, who's not a monster of U.S. history by any means, but he does believe we should have a strong and capable national government. And you say that, and a lot of libertarians are going to recoil and think that inherently, is a offense against our system, or has inherent dangers to our liberties. And certainly the founders understood, their dangers, which is why we get the Constitution. You get the strong and capable national government that can actually govern in the way the Articles of Confederation couldn't, but you get limits, and you need both. But I just think it's a mistake for people to, and people on the right do this as well, people on the left, to think that nationalism equals tribalism.
Yeah.
It doesn't. As you point out, it's a higher loyalty. It doesn't mean it should overwhelm every single other loyalty. We should still be loyal to our families and to our faith and to our neighborhoods, obviously. But it's something that all of us can feel as though we can belong to, above race, above ethnicity, sect, and partisanship. And at a time when identity politics is so strong, I think this is an important vehicle for unity that can't be neglected.
So what do you say? So you've got the libertarian critique, and then from the other direction, you've got the more traditionalist critique that says nationalism is dangerous because it's a higher loyalty that isn't God or Christianity or faith. How do you so that the nationalism, sort of like America as God, is it's sort of a form of idolatry, is basically what they would say from the other angle. So how would you respond to that criticism?
Yeah, so I don't think the nation should trump your faith or your conscience or your individuality. So I believe, in a liberal nationalism, which I believe has been the American tradition.
Right.
That we've gotten this balance right in a way. European countries and Central Eastern European countries haven't necessarily, which for me just goes to another aspect of American exceptionalism, that our nationalism is different and better, and always was seeded with these kind of liberal ideas. And so I think two things are important. One, the fact that we have a nation state is really important. You need a capable government, and the extent and the power of the nation are really important. But you need the ideals as well. And you read throughout our history, we did a lot of unworthy things when we were expanding across the continent. But the idea was we're spreading progress. We're spreading small d democracy. So that's always been caught up in our national project.
So before we get into some of the, not objections, but more practical and pragmatic problems with the case for nationalism, what is the case for nationalism as you lay out in your book? I could give a longer intro to that, but you wrote the book. So why don't, for the listeners and the viewers, you lay out what's the Rich Lowry case for nationalism?
Yes, we've already touched on a lot of it. That the definition of the word is wrong, that it's not identical to fascism or to Nazism. In fact, it rose with the emergence of modern democracy beginning in the 19th century. And, there have been other forms of government throughout history, And there have been empires, obviously, throughout history, some quite long lasting, but they've never been democratic. And that's because in an empire that encompasses a bunch of different peoples and a bunch of different nations, you need someone to decide and someone to rule. There's going to be a dominant language, there's going to be a dominant culture, inevitably, and whatever that choice is, the other nations and the other peoples aren't going to like it, and they're going to strain against it. And the history is whenever the repressive and coercive ability of an imperial power gives way, the nations go their own way. And this is the experience with the great European empires, Ottoman, Habsburg, Russian, experience with the Soviet Empire in the 20th century. As soon as it could no longer maintain control, the Poles are like, we want to govern ourselves, as they have throughout history, even though people have been concerned, have tried desperately to deny them that ability throughout history. And it's true with the Western colonial empires as well. The British and the French. As soon as you can't keep your boot on the neck of another people, they will want to govern themselves as a matter of basic dignity. And you need also, so I think in that sense, nationalism is inherently democratic, also in the sense that to have a true democracy, you need some common feeling and some social trust.
Right.
And if you look at the societies in the 20th and 21st century that have most lacked a sense of nationalism, it's in Africa and the Middle East, because a lot of colonial history and artificial borders. And it's not as though having no national feeling makes this place better, it makes it much worse, because you have to have loyalty and belonging to something. So it's to tribe or to sect, and then you don't trust the other tribe, you're not a member of the other tribe or the sect, and these societies get torn apart, they have civil wars, they have coups. And if you have a truly unified nation where all people feel a sense of common feeling and belonging, then you have the trust that makes democracy and a market economy possible. So that's a big part of the case. And then also, as I was discussing earlier, this is part of the American tradition. This is part of what made us great. Runs through Hamilton, runs through Lincoln, runs through TR, runs through FDR and Reagan. Now, all those figures, they're different iterations, they're different emphases, they're different ideologies, which goes to the fact that nationalism is a plastic force. You need to know more about someone to know where they are in a whole host of policy issues, other than the fact that they're a nationalist. But I think that the kind of lowest common denominator is of nationalism. We're going to put our people first. We're going to put our interest first, and we're going to be really jealous of our sovereignty. Now you can graft all sorts of ideologies on top of that. Bernie Sanders has some nationalistic impulses and attitudes. They kind of been beaten out of him recently, but you saw it in 2016. I discussed this in the book. Ezra Klein, editor of Vox, says, Bernie, you like poor people. Best thing for poor people, let them all from around the world come here. Bernie's like, no, that's the Koch brother idea. Too libertarian, we can't do that. We have to be loyal to our own workers. So that's basically a nationalist sentiment. Now, what's in the true interest of the nation, what's in the true interest of our workers, that's a huge argument. But the starting point should be that our first commitment is to them rather than other people around the world.
Well, this is why there was so much crossover between the Trump supporters and the Bernie Sanders supporters. One of the things one of the threads I wanted to pull on with you is, to what extent is this idea of nationalism being politically useful at this period in American history as a cohering and cohesive force, a bit like being just in time to be too late. So I really enjoyed your work on this. And then Yoram Hazony also had a book, The Virtue of Nationalism, also had some fascinating ideas. You mentioned Israel earlier in this podcast, and he actually focuses on Israel, and the biblical Israel as like one of the first well thought out versions of the nation. But to a degree, this is coming in response. This reconsidering of nationalism is coming in response to Trump, which, regardless of what your view of Trump is, he was an enormously disturbing force. He was a symptom of an American political landscape that was changing before anybody really managed to get their finger on it. So to what degree do you think it's possible for this populism, this new political landscape, to be harnessed into nationalism as a force that can bring everybody together?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a tricky thing, right? Because whenever Trump says something, you have at least half the people say, "Okay, I hate that thing, whatever it is."
Yeah.
So Trump saying I'm a nationalist makes nationalism more controversial, at least among half the electorate. So I don't know how to get around that. I do think whatever the ultimate word for it is, I think nationalism is the appropriate one. Maybe post-Trump, you're going to need to come up with something. Defending our, this is another argument I make in the book, is culture is really important to nations. And it's really important to our nation. And ideals are important, but you wouldn't have the ideals and if you didn't have the culture at the beginning. So defending that is crucially important for our future. And it's really basic things. It's like the English language, key ingredient of national cohesion. When you don't have it, Switzerland's an example, exception, but usually you don't have it, you get major social turmoil and even countries falling apart. You've seen this in Canada 20 years ago. Quebec tried to go its own way, French-speaking province in the middle of an English-speaking country. You see it in Catalonia now, in Spain. So defending the primacy of the English language is a huge thing. Teaching our history truthfully means acknowledging our sins, but not telling the story as one of unrelieved repression and woe, but the glorious story of, of a free people in a blessed land in a way that our schools and our universities don't, is hugely important. Defending our national heroes, our founders, our civic rights and rituals. Thanksgiving, people kind of scoffed at Trump. He said a couple weeks ago, Thanksgiving is under threat now. It is under threat, I think. It's not, we're not seeing the full force of it. By 10 years from now, I think there'll be a lot of people on the left really arguing it's a holiday about genocide, because of what we did to the Indian Americans. So this cultural agenda, I think, is really important to conservatism and to defending the nation. But most of this would have been common sense and non-controversial 40 years ago, right? JFK and his voters, most of them would have agreed with this. They wouldn't even question about it. But what's happened is this cosmopolitan wave has broken over our society. Beginning in the 60s and the 70s, sort of cosmopolitanism was an outsider attitude. It was the attitude of critics of society. Now it's the attitude of insiders and elites. So we kind of have a denationalizing elite for the first time ever. And then we have a business elite that, although I'm a free market guy and I love entrepreneurs and successful businesses, there's more of a transnational attitude to the business elite than there was 100 years ago. So the idea of the nation is under pressure, and the cultural core of our nation is under pressure more than ever before. And this will remain true whatever happens to Trump, and after Trump is gone, and conservatives need to have a response to it.
Because it's interesting you brought up the example of Thanksgiving, because one of the difficulties I see with this idea, which I'm very sort of philosophically supportive of, but pragmatically I'm having a bit of trouble getting my head around it. Because let's take the Thanksgiving example, when they try to say Thanksgiving is an emblem of the genocide of the American Indians, where that's a really historically ignorant position. When you look at the first Thanksgiving, none of the conflict between the Puritan settlers and the Indians started until after the governor William Bradford died. William Bradford, who really encouraged the Christian settlers to treat everybody really well, to ensure that any land that was purchased was paid for fairly and all of that. The original Thanksgiving, it genuinely was a meeting of cultures on equal grounds. And so when you're looking back at unifying figures, you can look at somebody like William Bradford, who avoided later mistakes that were made and later atrocities that were genuinely committed, and said, William Bradford is one of those American forebears that helps us light our way forward. But then what you're going to get is, William Bradford was also, by the standards of today, a homophobe and a transphobe. And the issue is that the target is moving so quickly that everybody will inevitably become somebody that we have to trash. I'm surprised it hasn't come, for example, for Martin Luther King Jr. yet, because he held the traditional Christian position on homosexuality, just to give you one example. So it seems to me like these figures are being, just as we point to them, they're getting torn down as fast as we can highlight them as figures worth pursuing. How do we get around that?
Yeah, so I mean that phenomenon, you're absolutely right. It's really true. It's really fast moving, and all we can do is sort of resist it with every fiber we have. And I think the standard should be, as you point out with Bradford, is were they better than kind of the average attitude of their time? I think that's important. And then also what is the scale of their historic achievements and the plus side? So Jefferson, was he better than the average attitude? I'm not sure, probably not by the end on race. I think it probably would have been a secessionist, if he had lived, unfortunately. But you get the Declaration of Independence, you get two presidential terms, you get the founding University of Virginia, where I went, you get huge influence on the development of freedom of religion in this country. So those are all huge plus sides. But I don't know how Jefferson's going to survive the current environment. It wouldn't shock me 20 years from now there's not a Jefferson memorial. But we just have to make the intellectual and moral case for these folks. And the advantage we have is still, even though elite opinion is almost universally hostile, we still, popular opinion is mostly with us. And we just need to hold to that fast, as hard as we can, and push back against the elites.
So interestingly, that brings me, because I actually, you won't remember this, but I met you this summer actually at the National Conservatism Conference. And I found that to be a fascinating conference because there was all of these people who had really thought through the macro philosophies on the issues that we saw happening on the ground. And I asked Patrick Deneen the same question, and I'd really like to hear your take, is coming out of that conference where you heard some of the smartest people speak to these issues, like you were one of the presenters, Yoram Hazony presented, Patrick Deneen presented. It was really a phenomenal conference and a lot of food for thought. But what did strike me is that a lot of the people who were at the conference would have opposed this phenomenon, the Trump phenomenon, back in 2015, 2016. It really was an attempt to try and figure out how to harness these forces and point them in a positive direction, which I'm very supportive of. But to what extent do you think the national conservatism idea is an idea that's cooked up in the laboratories of conservative intellectuals rather than something that can actually work on the ground and harvest real votes and drive real change?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I do think there is a large element with Trump of backfilling, because he comes out of nowhere and blows everything up. And usually when you have a movement and a takeover a party, it's been brewing for a while. The New Left took over the Democrats, in 1972, but you could see it coming. The huge conflicts within the party, for years prior to that, even bloodshed literally in the streets. This just came out of almost nowhere, not quite nowhere, but almost nowhere. So there's been a lot of thinking around it kind of after the fact, which is an unusual way to go about it. Usually do the thinking first, but I think it's appropriate. The way I think about it here at National Review is this crazy thing happened. So let's kick the tires of our assumptions. Let's open the aperture and not necessarily reject some things that we thought should just be not even considered. It doesn't mean you throw out all your principles or all your ideas. Maybe they're right. Maybe they survive these tests. So I think there is definitely backfilling, but it's appropriate. And what else is anyone supposed to do? Now, in terms of whether any of this can motivate voters, I think, Trump's shown it can, but with Trump, it is very difficult to disentangle what is just like the sheer personal force and what is the force of these attitudes and these ideas. So if Marco Rubio plopped down in 2016 and it said all the same things Trump did, in a different way, in a Marco Rubio way, but took the same positions, would he have won the nomination? Or was the Trump celebrity and this Trump magnetism a huge part of it? I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Yeah, Rubio was my guy. I'd like to think he could have won, but that might be wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah. But I do think this style of politics, though, not necessarily the way Trump does it, but a more nationalist, populist Republican Party has more of an opportunity probably to cross racial lines than a more stereotypical like Mitt Romney Republicanism, because I do think there are African-American, Latino, middle-class, working-class males who they love the flag, who they are patriotic, and they are, damn it, I worked hard to get here, and don't mind, sort of some of the machismo and kind of tough love attitudes. And if I were Trump, I'd be working that all the time. He's not going to get a lot of these voters, but he might get enough of an increment to make a difference in a really close election. But post-Trump, this needs to be thought through and integrated into the party's program, I think.
Yeah, so this brings me to the toughest set of questions. It's something I've really been grappling with, and I'd love to hear your take on it, especially after reading you on nationalism. Is one of just to give you one example that highlights what I'm talking about. I remember when the sort of shock poll, and we don't know how accurate this was because the questions were probably pretty leading, but they discovered that when Putin was accused of going after Hillary, support for Putin in the Republican Party spiked. And for me, what that was an indicator of was this really interesting cleavage in the country now, where it is two Americas, and those two Americas are, to my mind, I'd love to be corrected if you disagree, utterly irreconcilable, right? You have well, just look at how far the Democrats have gone on the campaign trail, right? You've got Beto O'Rourke sending up the test balloon on defunding religious institutions. You have Elizabeth Warren saying she's going to wear a Planned Parenthood scarf when she heads when she gets inaugurated, God forbid. You have Pete Buttigieg, who people aren't noticing how insidious this is, but is trying to basically claim the mantle of Christianity in order to beat Christians over the head with it, basically saying I'm the real Christian and things like that. And so I think that there's a lot of evangelicals. There's a lot of people in the Rust Belt. There's a lot of Trump people who look at that stuff and say, if I have to choose between a Russian thug and somebody who's going to shutter my church, somebody who's going to force gender ideology down the throats of my children, somebody who supports dismembering a baby at 29 weeks in the womb, at this point, maybe I would side with a Russian thug. Like, I don't think people thought that question through, because at the end of the day, the term American without shared values becomes sort of a useless term. And to what extent does half of America see the other half of America as the thing that's going to destroy America? Because it's pretty hard not to see somebody who supports abortion up until birth, right? Pete Buttigieg said when the baby takes its first breath, and he used a Bible verse to defend that. Somebody who says that kids should be transitioned, right? Literal castrations, mastectomies on healthy teen girls, you name it. To what extent can this abyss be bridged? Because looking at it, to me, I don't see where we could actually make a compromise with these people. And if we were going to, I don't think they would.
Yeah, it's a really important and consequential question. And I'm not, I try to be an optimist. I'm not particularly optimistic about this. The cultural divide, as you say, it's deeper than ever before. It wouldn't shock me. I know this sounds alarmist, but if Trump's reelected, it wouldn't shock me if we saw some really no-kidding defiance of federal authority out of California, and at some point in the next 4 years. But it's still, it's not. You'll see conservatives, compare it to the Civil War, which I think is ridiculous. Obviously we're not shooting at each other. We're not even the decade prior to the Civil War in the United States was incredibly, divisive, with violence on the floor of Congress, and we're just not there yet either. And actually, in the scheme of American history, it was an incredible period of social peace now, in terms of riots and crime and all that. But there is this deep cultural divide that's hard to see how it heals absent some sort of crisis. Yeah, that's unforeseeable. But the thing is, there's not, also a difference with the Civil War. There is a pretty clear geographic divide, and now it's all mixed up everywhere. It's like an urban and suburban / rural divide. So it's not as clear, but it's hugely concerning. I mean, just people with totally different ideas of what the Constitution is, of what the good life is, of what morality is, and as you say, a really hostile view of the other side as an existential threat.
Well, biology and human life.
Right, and what life is, yeah.
Because I think one of the interesting examples of this is the difference between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter, right? When you looked at like the civil rights movement of the late 50s and then the 60s, you saw a movement that subscribed to black liberation theology. A lot of them had socialist or communist ideas. But at the same time, they were making the case for their agenda based on fundamental American values, constitutional values, Christian values. And they weren't saying, come over to our side and adopt our ideology. They were saying, you are failing your own Christian values. You are failing American values. So the civil rights movement, despite the fact that many of them were left-wing figures, was firmly entrenched inside the American tradition. Black Lives Matter, on the other hand, actually has the destruction of the nuclear family and abortion until birth written into their platform if you go to their website. So it's a very different movement. And I know you've expressed your cynicism already, but I'm very curious as to whether the term American means anything in the age of Trump.
I think the term American does. I think we're divided about a lot of things, but not that. 80% of people maybe I'm speaking too soon there. Most people are proud of this country. I'm not sure how high the percentage is, but I think you're absolutely right about civil rights. And I think a lot of those figures in the civil rights movement, because they were left wing, they would have ended up, over time, like where the Black Lives Matter is. But there's a difference between the two movements. And you're absolutely right. The civil rights movement and its glory days was making the case, we are Americans, right? Yeah. And you're failing your own ideals and your own institutions, your own constitution. Black Lives Matter and associated attitudes and movements is really more concerned with tearing down the nation. And you see this with the 1619 Project, the New York Times. Important to focus on slavery. There's a lot of moving and true stuff in that series, but there are also a lot of lies about ourselves. And this is also, just the sweep of human history, a really bizarre thing, because usually throughout all history, you lie about the other guy, right? So, the French lie about the Germans, not that they need to lie very much to make them look bad. The Germans lie about the French, but lying about yourself and trying to delegitimize your own nation is something extraordinarily new. And that's, Black Lives Matter sees the nation as rotten to its core, as shot through with white supremacy and inexorably. And from the beginning, Beto O'Rourke, in his disgraceful campaign, one of his moments was he had this San Antonio roundtable with recent refugees and telling these people, desperate people who best thing that's ever going to happen to them or their families, they got here. What's he tell them about America, right? It's a white supremacist country. And God knows we've had our historical failings. We have our failings now. But that's about tearing us down and ripping out any ligaments that might unite us. And it's a really distressing phenomenon.
So when you point to the sort of the pantheon of American heroes, one of the things I was wondering, reading a lot of your work and then some of your subsequent commentary on your work in National Review, The Atlantic, etc., is that when you say, TR, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, that's going to be really appealing to a lot of conservatives. Teddy Roosevelt just with the sort of the populist rethink maybe, but like people are going to be really attracted to that. To what degree can a pantheon be created that might have more universal appeal, like throwing in Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and all of these people, and then really emphasizing this pantheon, because those heroes do exist. It's always amusing to me that Harriet Tubman is vaunted as a hero by the left, considering that she was a deeply, deeply religious, gun-owning person who would more or less disagree with them on all of their ideological positions. But can we start to put together a nationalism that does have broader appeal? Because my fear is, reading both your stuff, Yoram's stuff, and some of the other things that have been written, is that it appeals to people like me and like you, but it falls short as a unifier because we can't get it to reach the people we need it to reach for it to become a cohesive ideology.
Yes, I agree with you. A slight distinction when I mention those guys, I'm saying they're nationalist. I don't know enough about Harriet Tubman's thought or really about Frederick Douglass to call Douglass even necessarily a nationalist, but they're obviously American heroes. And this is something where I think the 1619 Project was right in its lead essay, which was poisonously dishonest in a lot of respects. But the fact that African Americans are part of the American cultural nation from the very beginning participated in every American war, even when they had no rights or coming back to a country that was going to repress them. Fought for freedom, in this country and expand our notion of rights. All that hugely important, hugely inspiring, and something that conservatives need to understand and soak themselves in and celebrate. So Frederick Douglass, get him on the currency. He's one of the great statesmen of the 19th century. He looks great, right? He doesn't take a bad photograph. Most photographed man by some estimates in the 19th century. But that's a key part of the American, not the African American, the American experience. So there is this terrible breach that happened between African American voters and the conservative movement with the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And it's a tragedy in my mind that this breach has occurred, because African Americans are so American. They're such a part of what this country is. And just in sheer electoral terms, if college educated whites keep trending against us, we're gonna have to go get more voters elsewhere. And it's been working class whites, in 2016, and that trend had been building over time. But it's also going to have to be other people of different colors and backgrounds. So we really need to work on that.
Well, and in reference to shared values, I remember I worked with a pro-life group, and we set up a pro-life display along Pennsylvania Avenue at Obama's second inauguration. And as people came off the grounds from listening to the speech, there was tens of thousands of African Americans coming out, and they're walking past the display. And my reaction was, they're not going to be happy about this at all, right? Obama being the most pro-abortion president ever elected. Almost every single one of them stopped and said, love what you're doing. We're so pro-life. They were, taking money out of their wallets. And these people are wearing bulletproof vest-sized Obama buttons, and yet they're hugely supportive of this pro-life display. And so the shared values are there. And if in a much broader section of the population, I think, than most people assume, it's just we're too segmented. And that's why I do see a potential coalition built around values and a lot of the things that you talk about in your book. But I guess from a pragmatic, practical perspective, when you're looking, let's narrow it down for a minute, just to 2020, and the scenarios of what happens, do you think, if trace it out. First, if Trump wins.
So if Trump wins, he'll win, and there's clearly a path there. This date, probably give him about a 50-50 chance, but there's no way he's winning the popular vote. He's going to lose the popular vote by more unless something extraordinary happens, and he's going to have to thread the electoral needle again. And polling, last month or so, and there's been some shock over this, shows he's right there, in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So, his path will also is more dependent than it shold be, because of the way he's governed and conduct himself on just completely destroying the other side. But he's really adept at that, and all those Democrats that you likely think have a chance to be nominated have big vulnerabilities. So what happens? I think it's going to be a second term. It's obviously much better than Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, but it's going to be rocky, because I think he's had trouble retaining good people. It's going to be even harder in a second term, and it's also it's not clear what the agenda would be. We haven't heard anything on what his second term agenda would be, and he probably still won't have the House. So there won't be any sort of governing partnership with the Republican Congress, which there was the first 2 years, which was provided a helpful focus, I think. So, better than the alternative, but rocky.
And so then the second set of questions is, one, who do you think the Democrats are most likely to nominate? Which I know is a dangerous question to ask before Iowa, but just take a shot with that in mind. And then second of all, what do you think happens if they beat Trump?
Yeah, so I have no idea now. I had a clear theory of the case 2 months ago. Most of the race, I thought Biden was overestimated and would deflate. And still, he still could finish fourth in Iowa and fourth in New Hampshire, and it's all over. But he's also showed more resilience than I would have expected, certainly in the national polling. And I think he has more paths than the other candidates. Because if he wins Iowa or New Hampshire, he's probably just a nominee. If he loses both, depending on how he loses and who beats him, he could still have a chance to revive in Nevada and South Carolina. But obviously, like really, really weak candidate, major performative problems, and I would just a risky candidate. You know, the thing is, he's supposed to be the safe guy, but you can't really throw him out into an intense national campaign with any confidence that he's not going to really step on himself at a crucial moment. So I might, at this moment, for the first time ever, I might get him a slightly higher percentage than anyone else. But I think Buttigieg, you know, even though it's kind of ridiculous, South Bend mayor, 8,500 votes total in his reelection in 2015. You know, student council presidents get more absolute votes than that in some schools. But hyper articulate, pivoted shrewdly when he realized everyone was making a mistake chasing Bernie down the track to, you know, the quote unquote moderate lane or relative moderate lane. Could win Iowa, could win New Hampshire, is a real thing. Bernie, shockingly, I think is stronger than he's ever been at the moment. Despite the heart attack, despite Warren's rise, which is abated, he could win Iowa. He could win New Hampshire, you know, and then it's a real desperate movement on the part of the party to stop him. Warren obviously giving away a lot of ground and momentum. Still, there's time. You know, she could revive as well. So this is a way of just saying, I just have no idea. And I also think there's probably still some chance of someone out there in Iowa catching fire just on the ground, like a Klobuchar or a Booker who's been neglected. So I think it's going to be fascinating. I think it's really fluid, and I think they're all flawed. And Bernie could be stronger than Warren, I think. I assume Biden and Buttigieg are stronger than him, but Biden, we talked about the performance. Buttigieg, I think they could have a real chance, the Trump campaign, to kind of Romneyize him. He is a little bloodless management consultant type and could have a real African-American turnout problem. So I don't, at the moment, you know, it always looks different once someone finally has won the nomination, but at the moment it doesn't look like a really strong field.
I feel like a troll asking a conservative author this question, but what do you think of Andrew Yang?
You know, I've come around a little bit. I'm not with him on robots. I think he's wrong on robots, and I also think he's wrong on universal basic income.
Right.
I think labor-saving technology is a great engine of economic growth and wage growth. It drives productivity. Unless you have productivity going up, you don't have higher wages. And if it's really true that labor-saving technology just throws everyone out of work, everyone would have been unemployed, 100 years ago when we stopped being farmers because, we had better farming, agricultural technology. But just in terms of a cause candidate, hugely successful. There's a debate, 2 debates ago, there's a whole segment devoted to his idea, universal basic income. And you had, not the most important candidates, but a couple of them endorsing it. Julian Castro, I believe, and Tulsi Gabbard. So, and he has also, just in the last debate, it didn't come up, but he showed some range in the last debate. I thought he was winsome and charming. He's actually thinking, which is unusual for a candidate. So this is a long way of saying I like him, but I think on his core thing, he's wrong.
Final question is, what do you think happens to the GOP if Trump loses? Like, there's a proviso. I know Mike Pence must think that, he's going to be the heir to the crown after all of this. It's the only reason he would have put up with as much as he's put up with. But it seems very unlikely that Pence is going to actually manage to take any leadership role after this. He'll have been too tainted by whatever these impeachment proceedings do and stuff like that. But what's your analysis if Trump loses in 2020? What's left of the Republican Party, which, as Trump tweeted today and most days actually, I think he has a 95% approval rating in the GOP right now.
Yeah, his bond with the party is absolutely extraordinary and like nothing we've ever seen. Obama was really bonded to his base, but this is something different. It's hard to say because I think if Trump loses, we're in it's passing the event horizon into a totally different world, and he's not going to go out gracefully. He's not going to go out easily, for the party. But parties generally aren't kind to one-term presidents, and I think you could see a lot of people who are telling every single pollster they're with them now turning their backs on him really quickly. And then we're in this debate that's been going on now, but will even be more intense and feel higher stakes. It will be higher stakes. Just what is the party? What are our ideas? What are our policies going forward? What can we learn from Trump? Or do we reject Trump? Or do we need another Trumpist? All this will be up for grabs. And the presidential campaign will start immediately. Starts basically, the day after Election Day. 2020 if he loses. And, Pence will want to run, Nikki Haley will want to run, Pompeo will want to run, Tom Cotton will want to run, Josh Hawley will want to run, and, 15 other people I'm not thinking of. Don Jr. Might want to run. So it's going to be a fascinating period. And I don't have the crystal ball to tell you how it's going to turn out.
Well, Rich, where can all of our listeners and viewers get a copy of your great book?
Thank you so much. Amazon.com.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate the conversation. These are great questions. Really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day.
Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with National Review editor and author Rich Lowry. If you want to check out our past episodes on subjects just like this, you can head over to iTunes, SoundCloud, LifeSiteNews.com under the podcast key, or on YouTube. Again, thanks so much for joining us this week, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.